The morning Emma Carver discovered her father's ledger hidden beneath the loose floorboard in his study, she felt the ground shift beneath her boots as surely as if the Texas earth itself had cracked open and swallowed everything she had ever believed to be true. It was the autumn of 1878, and the small cattle town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat baking under a relentless October sun that had no business being so harsh that late in the season. The town was young as towns go, barely 15 years past its founding, built on the backs of cattlemen and railroad speculators who had staked their futures on the western expansion of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everybody's business before the person themselves had sorted it out, where gossip traveled faster than horses and judgment settled like the perennial dust on every windowsill and porch railing. Emma was 22 years old, and she had buried her father, Robert Carver, just 3 weeks prior. The funeral had been simple, attended by most of Dusty Creek's residents, because Robert had been the town's feed merchant for nearly 20 years, a man of decent standing and quiet dignity. He had died of a fever that swept through him in late September with brutal efficiency, taking him from a warm Sunday supper to a cold grave in just 11 days. Emma had held his hand at the end, had pressed her forehead to his knuckles and wept quietly while the doctor stood in the doorway with nothing useful left to offer. She had believed, in those grief-soaked first weeks, that her greatest challenge would be learning to run the feed store alone. She had worked alongside her father since she was old enough to lift a grain sack, and she knew the inventory and the customers and the rhythms of the business the way she knew the lines of her own hands. Her mother had passed when Emma was 9, a fact that had always made the bond between father and daughter particularly fierce, particularly tender. She had believed the store would sustain her. She had believed the worst was already done. She had been wrong. The ledger told a story that her father had clearly never intended her to read. The handwriting was his, meticulous and slanted in the way she had always loved, but the numbers were devastating. Over the course of 3 years, Robert Carver had borrowed heavily. A drought had cut into his suppliers' yields, which had raised his costs. A late payment from the Hendricks cattle operation, one of his largest accounts, had left him short one season. He had borrowed from Silas Monroe, who was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a banker, a man who operated from the back office of his mercantile with an iron grip on the financial needs of half the county. He had borrowed at interest that compounded like a slow fire, and he had never quite caught up. The total debt written in the final column of the ledger was $342.60. To Emma, in the autumn of 1878, that number was as incomprehensible as the distance to the moon. The feed store had been mortgaged to Monroe as collateral. If Emma could not pay the debt within 60 days of her father's passing, Monroe had the legal right to claim the store, the stock, the building, and the small house attached to the back of the property, where Emma had spent her entire life. She sat on the floor of her father's study for a long time with the ledger in her lap, reading it twice to make sure she had understood correctly, and then a third time because some part of her mind kept insisting she must have made a mistake. The afternoon light moved across the floorboards, dust motes drifted. The clock on the wall ticked with serene indifference to her devastation. She did not cry. She had already cried every tear she had in her body during those 11 days of her father's fever, and then during the funeral, and then during the quiet nights after. What settled into her chest now was something harder and colder than grief. It was the specific dread of a woman who understands that she is entirely alone and entirely responsible, and that the world does not pause for either condition. She had 60 days. She had $342.60 worth of debt, and she had a feed store whose daily receipts, even in a good week, barely covered its own operating costs. Louis Lawson had been in Dusty Creek for 4 years, which made him one of the more established residents despite the fact that he was only 26 years old. He had arrived with a small remuda of horses and a reputation from the San Antonio horse fairs as a man who understood animals in a way that bordered on something almost mystical. He had set up a livery and training operation on the eastern edge of town, a spread of about 40 acres that he had purchased with prize money won in 2 consecutive regional racing competitions. The horse that had won him that money, and a good deal of his reputation, was a 4-year-old bay stallion he called Reckoning. The horse was extraordinary by any measure that mattered in the West of 1878. Reckoning stood 16 hands at the shoulder, with the kind of deep chest and powerful haunches that announced speed before the animal had taken a single step. He had a temperament that was intelligent and responsive without being easily spooked, a combination rare enough that experienced horsemen came from 3 counties away just to watch him run. Louis had trained him from a foal, and the bond between the man and the horse was the kind of thing that made observers go quiet and thoughtful, the way people go quiet in the presence of something genuinely beautiful. Louis was not a man given to elaborate social performance. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hands that were always calloused and always clean, a combination that suggested both work and care. He had dark hair that he kept short and brown eyes that were more serious than any person had a right to be at 26. He smiled infrequently enough that when he did, the recipients of that smile tended to remember it for longer than they expected to. He knew Emma Carver the way most people in Dusty Creek knew their neighbors, which is to say he knew her face and her name and the broad strokes of her circumstances. He bought feed from her father's store every week. He had watched her work the counter with efficient competence and had registered, in the way you register information that you do not yet know what to do with, that she was quite lovely and quite serious and quite clearly uninterested in being treated as anything other than a competent businesswoman. He had respected that. He had also, if he was honest with himself in the quiet hours of early morning, when a man's guard is most completely down, thought about her more than the basic requirements of commerce could explain. He heard about Robert Carver's death the way everyone in Dusty Creek eventually heard about everything. He was at the barber shop getting his hair cut when Ned Pulver, who worked as a clerk at Monroe's Mercantile, was in the next chair going on about how Silas Monroe was already discussing what he planned to do with the Carver property once the 60 days elapsed. Ned spoke about it with the casual viciousness of a man who has never worried about money himself and therefore feels comfortable treating other people's financial ruin as entertainment. Louis said nothing. He finished his haircut, paid his 15 cents, settled his hat on his head, and walked back to his livery operation with his jaw set in a way that his stable hand, a 17-year-old named Hector Vega, recognized as the expression Louis wore when he had decided something and was working out the details. "You all right?" Hector asked. "Fine," Louis said, which was what he always said, and then he went and stood at Reckoning's stall for a long time, resting his forearms on the gate and watching the stallion move. The mathematics of Louis's situation were not complicated. He had money saved, but not $342 worth. He had the livery operation, but he would not liquidate that because it was his income and his future. He had several horses of quality, but none so valuable as Reckoning, whose reputation and performance record made him worth considerably more than the debt in question. He told himself he was not going to do it. He went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the coyotes and telling himself he was not going to do it. He woke up the next morning and told himself again that he was absolutely not going to do it. He saddled Reckoning before breakfast and rode north to the property of a man named Clarence Boudreau, who raised thoroughbred racing stock and had made an offer on Reckoning 18 months prior that Louis had turned down flat. Clarence was a large, red-faced man who kept a very fine house and a very fine whiskey, and who greeted Louis on the porch with the particular wariness of a man who has been refused before and is not sure what to make of a second visit. Boudreaux, Louis said, remaining in the saddle because that was the posture of a man who was still uncertain. Lawson, said Clarence, that is a fine animal you are sitting on. He is, Louis agreed. There was a silence in which both men understood that Louis had not ridden up here to argue about it. $360, Clarence said, because a man like Clarence did not survive in the horse trade by waiting for other people to name their price. $350, Louis said, because he could not quite bring himself to accept the round number without at least some negotiation, some small insistence that this was not desperation. $350, Clarence agreed, and Louis dismounted. He stood with his hand on Reckoning's neck for a long moment. The horse turned his large dark eye toward Louis with an expression that could not have been more than projection, more than a man seeing what he needed to see in an animal's gaze, but which felt in that moment unbearably comprehending. Louis exhaled slowly and rubbed the stallion's jaw one final time. "You take care of him," Louis said to Clarence. "I always take care of my horses," Clarence said, which was true enough that it offered some comfort. Louis walked back into town with $350 in his coat pocket, and Reckoning's absence at his side, as physical as a wound. He went directly to Monroe's mercantile, walked past the dry goods and the bolts of fabric and the barrels of salted pork, and into the back office where Silas Monroe sat behind his desk with the self-satisfied air of a man who believes he has already won every game currently in play. Monroe was in his late 40s, with a full silver mustache and small, sharp eyes that had calculated interest rates long enough that they had taken on something of the quality themselves. He looked up at Louis's entry with mild surprise and somewhat more curiosity. "Lawson," he said, "what can I do for you?" "You can take this," Louis said, placing $342.60 on the desk, "and mark the Carver debt as settled." Monroe looked at the money for a long, thoughtful moment. He was a man who understood leverage and timing, and he recognized when he was looking at something that did not serve his interests in the way the original arrangement had promised. "I had plans for that property," Monroe said. "The debt was the arrangement," Louis said. "Pay the debt, the property stands. That was your agreement with Robert Carver, in writing, and I expect you are too careful a man to have left yourself any room to wriggle out of the written terms." Monroe's jaw tightened, which confirmed that Louis was correct about the terms. He was, indeed, a careful man. "This isn't your affair, Lawson. Take the money or I will ride to the county seat and have a lawyer confirm what the written terms of your agreement are, and then I will come back and you will still take the money." Louis's voice was even. He was not threatening so much as he was stating a sequence of inevitable events. Monroe looked at him for another long moment, and then, with the practiced composure of a man who absorbs losses without displaying them, he counted the money. "What do I say to Miss Carver?" he asked. "You say the debt's been settled by an anonymous account of her father's that you located after further review of your records." Louis had thought this part through carefully. "You tell her the matter is resolved and no further payment is required." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Anonymous. She does not know and she does not need to know," Louis said. "Just settle it." Monroe wrote out the receipt and handed it across the desk. Louis left it sitting there. He did not need the receipt. He walked back out through the mercantile, past the bolts of fabric and the barrels of pork, and out into the October afternoon where the dust was blowing in off the flats in the slow, dry way it always did this time of year. He felt the absence of Reckoning like a missing tooth, persistent and strange, noticed every time he turned his attention in that direction. He went home and told Hector to put the second-best horse, a gray mare named Prairie, in Reckoning's stall, and when Hector asked where Reckoning was, Louis said he had sold him and did not say anything more. Hector, who was perceptive despite his youth, did not press. Emma received the news from Silas Monroe the following Thursday, 2 days after Louis's visit to his back office. Monroe came to the store himself, which was unusual enough that Emma's stomach dropped the moment she saw him push through the door. She had been bracing herself for a version of this conversation that she had rehearsed 100 times, in which she would negotiate, plead, propose a payment schedule, and ultimately lose everything anyway. What Monroe said instead was a careful recitation of the story Louis had constructed for him, that a review of the accounts had revealed an old deposit note of Robert Carver's, a discrepancy in the records that had, in Monroe's telling, resolved itself to a sum sufficient to settle the outstanding debt in full. He handed Emma the paperwork showing a zero balance on her father's account, and he did it with the specific discomfort of a man reciting lines written by someone else. Emma was too stunned to interrogate the explanation closely. She stared at the paperwork and felt something crack open in her chest that was not grief and not relief, but something that combined both in a proportion she could not immediately identify. "So the store is mine," she said. "Free and clear," Monroe confirmed, which cost him something visible but was accurate. After he left, Emma sat down on the stool behind the counter and pressed her palms flat against the worn wood and breathed. She thought about her father, about the debt he had carried in silence, about the years he had worked so hard and worried so privately that his daughter had never known. She thought about what it meant to be free of it, and she cried, quietly and briefly, and then she straightened her spine and wiped her face and opened the store for the day. She did not wonder about the explanation for long. She was grieving and exhausted and managing a business alone, and the relief was so enormous that she was grateful for it without examining it too closely. The idea that her father might have had some old account she had not known about fit well enough into the image of a man who had never discussed money with his daughter, who had kept his worries private and his books hidden. It was not implausible. She accepted it. She filed the paperwork in the desk where she kept the store's documents, and she thought about it less and less as November arrived and brought with it the particular business of winter preparations in a cattle town. Louis came in every week for feed, as he always had. The transactions were brief and professional. Emma filled his order, recorded it in the ledger, and accepted his payment with the focused competence she brought to every interaction. Louis said thank you and goodbye and walked out with his grain and his oil cake and whatever hay supplement Prairie or the other horses needed that week. He watched her. Not with the open, obvious watching of a man who has no self-awareness, but with the quiet, careful attention of a man who has done something significant for someone and is content to let it exist without acknowledgement, while also being unable to stop noticing her. He noticed the way she moved behind the counter with the efficiency of long practice, the way she measured grain by feel as much as by the scoop, the way she remembered every customer's account balance without consulting the ledger. He noticed the small line between her brows that appeared when she was calculating, and the way it smoothed out when the numbers satisfied her. He noticed that she wore her dark hair pinned back with a practicality that nevertheless allowed for two small curls near her temples that had clearly not been disciplined into submission, and that she seemed either unaware of them or had decided they were not worth the effort, and either explanation struck him as entirely in keeping with her character. He did not speak to her beyond the requirements of commerce. He was not sure what he would say. It was Hector who opened the door, inadvertently, carelessly, with the casual damage that only the young and the helpful can accomplish. It was the first week of December, and Louis had sent Hector to the feed store with the week's order because he himself was occupied with a particularly difficult horse that a rancher had brought in for training, an animal with bad habits and worse manners that required Louis's full attention. Hector returned with the feed and also with the information that Miss Carver had been asking how Reckoning was doing, since she had not seen the big bay stallion in the corral when she passed on her way to the church social 2 weeks prior. Louis looked up from the horse he was working. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I said I didn't know where he was," Hector said, which was technically true and also entirely unhelpful as a cover story. Louis rubbed the back of his neck. "She seemed concerned," Hector added. "She asked if he was sick." "He's fine," Louis said, and then, because Hector was still watching him with 17-year-old transparency, said, "He went to a good operation up north. He's fine." Hector nodded slowly. "She asked me to tell you she hopes he recovers. She thinks he's sick." "You told me to say I didn't know where he was." Louis exhaled. "That's fair," he said, and went back to the difficult horse. But the exchange sat with him, as small exchanges sometimes do when they are connected to something larger. He thought about Emma asking after reckoning with concern in her voice, and he thought about what that said about the kind of woman she was, and he thought about how it would feel to tell her the truth. And then he thought about how he had specifically made Monroe construct a story precisely so she would never know, and he concluded that his position was consistent and reasonable, and that he would maintain it. He maintained it for approximately 10 more days. What broke it open was not anything calculated or dramatic. It was an afternoon in mid-December when Emma came into the livery, because Prairie had been bought at his operation, and Emma had needed to board 2 horses temporarily while she had some work done on her small back stable, and she came to see how her animals were settling. Louis was in the stable when she arrived, mending a piece of harness with the focused attention he gave to small repairs, and they were unexpectedly alone because Hector had gone into town for an hour. They exchanged the usual pleasantries about the horses, and Emma complimented the cleanliness of the operation, and Louis said something understated about it being simply standard practice. And then they arrived at one of those small silences that, in another configuration, might have led somewhere or gone nowhere. Emma looked around the stable with the frank, curious gaze she had always had, the gaze of a woman who pays attention to the world she operates in. She glanced at the large center stall, the one that was visibly roomier and better appointed than the others, the one where Prairie now stood, and which was somewhat too large for a gray mare of Prairie's modest proportions. "That stall seems built for a bigger animal," she said. "It was," Louis said, and then stopped. Emma looked at him. "What happened to the horse?" she asked, and her voice carried genuine interest, not the polite, conversational interest you extend to an acquaintance, but the kind that comes from actually wanting to know. "I sold him," Louis said. He had not intended to say anything further, but there was something about the directness of her attention that made evasion feel worse than truth. "He was a racing stallion, bay, 16 hands, about the best horse I have ever had the privilege of working with." Emma was watching his face. She was perceptive, which he had known, and she was also quiet in the particular way of a person who understands that silence is an invitation. "I am sorry," she said. "That sounds like a real loss." "It was," Louis said simply. "Did you need the money?" she asked, and then immediately said, "Forgive me, that is none of my business." "It's all right," he said. And there it was, the moment, the thread, and he did not pull it and she did not pull it, and they both stood in the clean-smelling stable while Prairie shifted her weight contentedly in the oversized stall, and the moment passed into the next moment without the truth coming out. But something had changed, nevertheless. Emma left the stable that afternoon with a small, unidentifiable feeling of having been shown something real, something that the usual commercial interactions did not permit. She found herself thinking about it while she closed the store that evening, while she ate her supper alone in the small back house that was now, against all probability, still hers. She thought about Louis Lawson's face when he talked about the horse he had sold. The expression had been brief, carefully controlled, but she had seen it before she had seen him control it. It was not quite grief, not in the way she understood grief, but it was in the same family. It was loss worn with the composure of someone who has decided that loss is not a thing to be performed for an audience. She respected that. She respected it in a way that was not entirely comfortable because it was the first time she had respected something about a specific person in quite a while. She went back to the livery the following week, ostensibly to check on her horses, actually because she found she wanted to. Louis was in the yard working a young horse on a long lead line, moving the animal in circles with patient, steady instruction, and Emma stood at the fence for a moment and watched before he noticed her. The work was precise and unhurried, and she could see why people came from 3 counties away. He saw her and lifted a hand in greeting and brought the horse around, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. They talked about the winter coming in, about the reliability of the local farrier, about a rumor that the railroad was considering extending a spur line that would change the cattle shipping logistics for half the county. The conversation was easy and unremarkable except for the fact that neither of them wanted to stop having it. "Your horses look well," Louis said, meaning her boarded animals. "Your operation is well run," Emma said, meaning more than the operation, though she would not have said so. She walked back to town aware that she was smiling, which she noted with some surprise, as smiling had not been something that came easily in the months since her father's passing. The weeks between that mid-December afternoon and Christmas passed with a rhythm that neither of them had engineered but both had encouraged. Emma found reasons to visit the livery beyond her animals. Louis found reasons to linger longer at the feed store than the transaction required. They discovered, in the gradual, accumulating way that 2 self-sufficient and private people discover these things, that the other person was someone they did not want to be absent from. They talked about their lives. Louis told her about growing up outside San Antonio, the 4th of 5 children of a horse trader who had taught him everything useful he knew and several things that were less useful. He told her about the horse fairs and the prize money and the decision to come north and build something of his own. He told her about the satisfaction of a well-trained horse, the specific pleasure of taking an animal from wildness to partnership. Emma told him about her mother's death when she was 9, and the way her father had handled it by teaching her to work, which she understood in retrospect as both a coping mechanism and a gift. She told him about learning the feed business from the ground up, about knowing every rancher and farmer in 4 counties by their buying habits and their credit history. She told him about the grief of the past autumn with an honesty that surprised her, because she was not in the habit of vulnerability, and she found that with Louis, honesty felt like a natural state rather than a risk. He listened to her with the same full attention he gave to horses and harness, the kind of attention that makes a person feel as though they are the only thing in the landscape. Christmas in Dusty Creek in 1878 was marked by a small church service, a community dinner in the meeting hall, and several inches of unusual snow that transformed the town into something almost tender. Louis walked Emma home from the community dinner because the snow had made the road slick, and he had offered and she had accepted. And they walked through the quiet white streets of Dusty Creek with their breath clouding in the cold air, and neither of them speaking very much. And somewhere in that silence, something settled between them that was warmer than the weather. At her door he paused and she paused, and there was a moment of such precise and weighted uncertainty that it almost hurt. And then Emma said, "Thank you, Louis." And the way she said his name, simply and with a warmth that she had not bothered to moderate, was as clear as anything she had ever said to him. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Emma," he said, and walked back through the snow. January brought new cold and new closeness. Louis began stopping by the store in the evenings after closing, when Emma was doing her accounts, and she began leaving the back door unlatched as a signal, a small and private thing between them that neither acknowledged directly but both understood. He would sit in the chair across from her father's desk, which she had claimed for her own, and they would talk while she worked through the numbers, and sometimes she would read aloud from whatever book she was working through, and sometimes they played cards, and sometimes they sat in a comfortable silence that was evidence of how far they had come from the formal commerce of their early acquaintance. One evening in late January, Louis brought her a small gift, a well-made journal with a leather cover, because she had mentioned once that she kept accounts in whatever book was available and had never had something designed specifically for the purpose. It was a practical gift, which was the kind they both instinctively gave and received, but the care that had gone into the choosing of it was apparent in the quality of the binding and the smooth, cream-colored pages. Emma held it for a moment and then looked up at him with an expression that she did not quite manage to keep neutral. "Louis," she said. "It's practical," he said, which was both accurate and a kind of disclaimer. "It is," she agreed. "It is also very thoughtful." He met her eyes and did not look away, which was the clearest thing he had said to her in 2 months of increasingly clear conversations. She reached across the desk and touched his hand, briefly, barely more than a brush of her fingers across his knuckles, and pulled back. He turned his hand over so it was palm up on the desk. She looked at it, and then at him, and then placed her hand in his, and they sat like that while the lamp burned low and the January wind pressed at the windows. And Louis thought about reckoning and about $350 and about how none of it mattered. And Emma thought about her father and about debt, and about how a life can change direction without warning and still, somehow, end up somewhere good. February arrived, and the question of what they were to each other had been answered without being formally stated, in the way of people who are both certain and cautious. They were seen together in town often enough that Dusty Creek's gossip mill had established them as a settled matter. And since Dusty Creek was a small enough town that settled matters were immediately and comprehensively discussed, they were occasionally subjected to the particular warmth and intrusiveness of a community that has decided it approves of you. The widow Henderson, who was 60 years old and forthright about everyone's business, told Emma directly that Louis Lawson was a good man, and that Emma ought not to waste time being shy about it. Emma, who was not shy but had a highly developed sense of privacy, thanked the widow Henderson for her counsel with a smile that was entirely sincere and entirely unrevealing. Old Pete, who ran the stable at the edge of town and had known Louis since he arrived in Dusty Creek, told Louis that Miss Carver was a sensible woman, and that sensible women were rarer than champion horses, and he ought not to let her slip away. Louis said thank you to Pete in the same tone he used for most of Pete's advice, which was the tone of a man who has heard something true and does not want to give too much credit for the accuracy. What Louis did not know was that February also brought Emma to a moment of questioning. She had been going through her father's papers more thoroughly, the way you do when the shock of initial loss gives way to the practical necessity of settling an estate, and she was organizing receipts and old contracts and correspondence, and she came across a letter from a man named Boudreaux. The letter was from 18 months prior, and it was a formal offer to purchase a bay stallion named Reckoning from one Louis Lawson at the price of $360, which offer was noted in the letter as having been declined. Emma read this letter twice, and then she sat with it and thought about what she knew. Louis's horse had disappeared. He had told her he had sold the horse. The debt on her father's store had been mysteriously and improbably settled. Monroe had given her an explanation that she had accepted because she was exhausted and grateful, but which, revisited now with more clarity, had the particular texture of a story assembled to serve a purpose. She felt the math of it assemble itself in her mind with the same clarity she brought to her store ledgers, and when it finished assembling, she sat very still for a long time. Then she put the letter aside and went back to organizing the papers. She did not confront Louis the next time she saw him, which was 2 days later when he came to the store. She watched him during the transaction with the careful attention of a woman reassessing everything she thought she understood. He was the same as he always was, direct, quiet, considerate in the specific way of a person who notices things without being asked to. He paid for his feed and reached for the bags and paused and asked if she was all right because she had been quieter than usual. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "About what?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "About how people help each other," she said, "and why they don't always say so." A muscle moved in his jaw. It was brief and controlled, but Emma was paying attention. "Sometimes telling complicates things that don't need to be complicated," he said carefully. "Or sometimes it complicates things that need to be understood," she said. He met her eyes and held them. The store was empty except for the two of them, and the winter light came through the front window in that flat, honest way it has in February, illuminating everything without sentiment. "Emma," he said, "did you sell your horse to pay my father's debt?" she asked. The silence was the length of several heartbeats, during which every possible answer arranged itself and then collapsed to the only one that was true. "Yes," he said. Emma had been certain for 2 days, and yet the confirmation landed with a weight she had not quite anticipated. She held onto the counter with both hands, not for physical support, but for something to press against while the wave of it moved through her. "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question. Louis set the feed bags back down on the counter. He was looking at the counter, not at her, which was one of the few times she had seen him not look directly at the thing he was addressing. "Because Monroe would have taken everything," he said. "The store, the house, everything your father built. I did not think that was right." "It was $342, she said. $350, he said. "I got $350 for him." "Louis." Her voice was doing something she was not entirely controlling. "That horse was your livelihood. He was your champion. He was, by every account I have ever heard, irreplaceable." "He was a horse," Louis said, and then, quietly, "and you are not." She stared at him. He was still looking at the counter, his hands flat on the surface, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that this had cost him more to say than most things cost him. "You could have told me," she said. "I would have found another way. I would have sold something or negotiated with Monroe, or you didn't have anything to sell that would have been enough," Louis said. "And Monroe would not have negotiated because he wanted the property." He looked up then. "You were 3 weeks out of burying your father. You were managing this store alone. You were keeping everything together with a kind of steadiness that most people couldn't have managed. I did not want to add to what you were carrying." Emma held his gaze. She was aware of the magnitude of what he had done in a way that pressed on her chest with something between gratitude and pain. "You have been coming here every week," she said. "You have been sitting in my father's study in the evenings. We have been—" She stopped. "And all this time you knew and you said nothing." "I knew," he agreed. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't about recognition. I didn't do it so you would thank me or so you would feel obligated to me. I did it because it needed to be done and I could do it. That is all. That is all," he had said, as if $350 and the loss of the finest horse in 4 counties and 4 months of silence were a small and ordinary thing. "You have to understand," she said, "that I do not know what to do with this." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything in return." "I know you're not," she said. "That is part of what I don't know what to do with." The conversation ended there, not because they had resolved anything, but because a customer came in and Emma resumed the function of a woman running a business, and Louis picked up his feed bags and said goodbye and walked out into the February afternoon. He walked home with the feeling of a man who has put a weight down and is not sure whether the ground beneath him is solid. Emma went through the rest of the day on a kind of automatic competence, measuring and recording and making change and thanking customers, while inside her something large and unresolved moved in circles like a horse on a long lead line. She had known, she supposed, for the 2 days since she found the letter. Had known and not known, had constructed the possibility without wanting to confirm it because confirmation would require her to reckon with what it meant about the kind of man Louis Lawson was, what it meant about the 4 months she had spent coming to know him, thinking she was discovering him when in fact she had already been the recipient of the most significant thing he had ever given another person, and had not known it. She thought about the oversized stall in his stable, the one built for a bigger animal. She thought about the way he had said the horse's name, reckoning, with the particular quietness of something that was still tender. She thought about what it meant to give something irreplaceable for the sake of someone you barely knew at the time. He had done it, he said, because it needed to be done and he could do it, because she was carrying enough, because Monroe would have taken everything. She closed the store and went to the back house and made herself a supper she barely tasted and sat with her father's ledger and the letter from Boudreaux both open on the table and looked at them for a long time. Then she put on her coat and went to the livery. The evening was cold but clear, and the stars over Dusty Creek were the extravagant, unobstructed kind that only appear when the sky is completely without cloud. Louis was in the stable checking the horses for the night, his lamp throwing warm gold light through the open door, and he looked up when Emma came in with an expression that was prepared for almost anything she might say. She stopped inside the door and folded her hands in front of her and looked at him. "I have spent the afternoon thinking about what you did," she said. He waited. "And thinking about what you told me, that you didn't do it for recognition or obligation. That you did it because it needed to be done." She paused. "I believe you." "I know," he said, "but I also need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who wants to be managed or protected without her knowledge. I am not a child who needs to be shielded from the condition of her own life." Her voice was firm but not angry, the voice of someone making a sincere claim about herself. "If something concerns me, I want to know about it." "That is fair," he said. "At the same time," she continued, and her voice shifted slightly, "I have been trying to think of a single thing I have ever seen done in this town that matches what you did, and I cannot find one." She looked at him steadily. "You sacrificed something that was genuinely irreplaceable to save everything my father built, for a woman you barely knew, and you did it without telling me and without asking for anything." She paused. "Louis, I do not know what to call that except extraordinary." He looked at her for a long moment. The horses moved softly in their stalls. Prairie nickered at something in the dark beyond the stable walls. "I knew you well enough," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means by the time I made that decision, I had been buying feed from you for 4 years," he said. "I knew you worked harder than anyone in that store. I knew you were the kind of person who would give her father good care and full presence at the end. I knew the town would be lesser without you in it." A pause. "And I knew that I had been paying attention to you in a way that went considerably beyond what the weekly grain order required." The words settled between them in the clean, cold air of the stable. Emma felt something release in her chest that had been held very tight since February began. "Why didn't you tell me then?" she asked, not accusatory. Genuinely curious. "Because then it would have seemed like I did it to impress you," he said, "and that would have made it something different than what it was." She crossed the stable slowly and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to meet his eyes, and she looked at him with the full directness that was her natural mode. "I am going to pay you back," she said. "Emma, not all at once," she said. "I don't have it all at once, but I will pay you back because otherwise it is not between us as equals, and I need it to be between us as equals." She held his gaze. "Can you agree to that?" He considered it. She could see him working through the reasons he had chosen not to accept anything in return, and she could see him assess them against what she was actually asking for, and she watched him arrive at the understanding that she was not offering repayment out of wounded pride, but out of a genuine need for the terms between them to be clean and mutual. "I can agree to that," he said. "Good," she said. And then, because the distance between them was very small and had been very small for several months, and she was done waiting for something that was already true, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was the first kiss, and it had the quality of a first kiss that has been building across months of carefully maintained distance, brief and certain and entirely mutual, a closing of space that had always been temporary. When she pulled back, Louis's expression was as close to undone as she had ever seen it, which was perhaps the most satisfying thing she had witnessed in some time. "All right," he said, in the voice of a man who has been thoroughly rearranged. "All right," she agreed, with a smile that she did not try to moderate at all. The months that followed had a particular quality of happiness that neither of them performed for the benefit of Dusty Creek's observant population, but which Dusty Creek observed nonetheless, with the collective satisfaction of a community that has been waiting for a conclusion it considered obvious. The widow Henderson told anyone who would listen that she had seen this coming the prior autumn. Old Pete said nothing, but was observed to be in a consistently better mood. Hector, who had watched the whole slow progression of the thing with increasing impatience, told Louis with the bluntness of a 17-year-old that it was about time. Spring arrived in Texas with its usual extravagance, a transition from winter that bypassed subtlety entirely and moved directly to warmth and color and the loud insistence of new growth. Emma's feed store had a good March as the ranchers began their spring preparations, and the store's accounts were, for the first time since her father's illness, solidly in the positive. True to her word, she had begun setting aside a portion of the store's weekly earnings toward what she thought of privately as the reckoning fund. She had not discussed the ongoing nature of this project with Louis, in part because he objected each time she raised it, and in part because she had decided that the accounting of it was her business, and she would inform him only when she had something concrete to deliver. Louis had acquired 2 new training clients in the spring, both of them cattle operations from the next county whose owners had heard about his methods from ranchers in Dusty Creek. He worked the horses with the same patient precision he brought to everything, and his reputation, which had been built largely on Reckoning's performance, was now being rebuilt on the quality of his training work, which was a more durable foundation. They spent their evenings together more often than not. Emma kept the back house on the feed store property, and Louis's livery was a 15-minute walk across town, and they fell into the habit of alternating, some evenings at her place and some evenings at his. Louis had a small house attached to the livery operation, clean and spare and very nearly too organized, the house of a man who spent most of his interior life in stables and had transferred that precision to his living space. Emma approved of it. She was not a woman who required decoration, but she required order, and Louis's version of order was compatible with hers. They cooked together and talked together and disagreed occasionally about things of substance, because they were both people of strong convictions, and the coexistence of strong convictions requires some degree of regular negotiation. They disagreed, for instance, about the question of credit terms for struggling ranchers. Emma believed in flexibility, and Louis believed in clear terms clearly enforced, and both positions had merit, and they argued it out one evening in April with the kind of passionate, well-reasoned disagreement that does not damage a relationship, but maps the contours of 2 people's fundamental natures. "If I had not extended credit to the Fowler operation last spring," Emma said, "they would have lost their breeding stock, and they would not be one of my steadiest accounts now." "And if they had not paid," Louis said, "you would have been out the cost of the feed and with no recovery. But they did pay. They happened to pay," he said. "You could not have known that at the time." "I could make an informed judgment based on 10 years of watching that family work," she said. "That is a qualitative judgment, not a financial one." "In a town this size, a qualitative judgment is a financial one," she said. "You know these people. You know whether they are going to pay." Louis was quiet for a moment, which was how he processed arguments that had just landed effectively. "That is true in Dusty Creek," he said. "It would not be true everywhere." "Then it is fortunate," she said, "that I am in Dusty Creek." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as reserved specifically for the moments when she had argued something well, a mixture of resistance and appreciation that he usually resolved by changing the subject. "More coffee?" he asked. "Yes, please," she said, with a smile that was completely shameless. In May, Emma's repayment fund reached $100, a milestone she noted in the journal Louis had given her in January, with the same meticulous satisfaction she brought to every balance sheet. She told Louis about the $100 on an evening when they were sitting on the porch of the livery house watching the light go out of the sky in stages, the long June twilight doing everything it could to delay the dark. "Emma," he started. $100, she said. "I have it here." She produced an envelope from her coat pocket. "And I will have the rest by next year." I told you, she said pleasantly, "that I need it to be between us as equals." You agreed. She held out the envelope. He looked at her. He looked at the envelope. He took it with the grace of a man who has recognized a battle he agreed to lose. 250 remaining, he said. By next spring at the latest, she said with absolute confidence. He set the envelope on the rail between them and looked at the darkening sky. You know that money can't buy back what was given, he said. The value of the thing isn't the same as the price. No, she agreed. It isn't, but money is what I have, and what I have is what I can give. She paused, though it is not the only thing. He looked at her sideways. She looked at the sky. The first star was appearing above the southern horizon, very bright and very steady. I love you, she said, without looking at him, because she was new to saying it, and saying it toward the open sky felt more manageable than saying it directly at another person. I wanted you to know that, separate from the repayment, separate from everything else. I just love you. The porch was very quiet. Prairie moved in the stable, a soft sound. Emma, he said, and his voice had dropped to something she had never quite heard from him before, the voice underneath the composed, careful voice, the one that did not often see daylight. She turned and looked at him then, because whatever he was about to say, she wanted to see his face when he said it. I have loved you since long before I sold that horse, he said. Possibly since the first winter I was in Dusty Creek, when you were 19 years old and you told old Hank Mercer that his account was 2 weeks late and you would give him 1 more week and then you would need payment. And you said it with such complete evenness, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, and he went red in the face and you did not move a single muscle. He paused. I thought that was the most competent person I had ever encountered. Emma stared at him. You remembered that. I have an excellent memory, he said. She laughed. It was a full and genuine laugh, surprised out of her, and Louis smiled at the sound of it, the rare and complete smile that she had learned to watch for. You could have mentioned something, she said. You were 19, he said, and you were very clearly not looking for that kind of attention. I was not, she agreed, but I am 22 now. You are, he said. He reached over and took her hand from the porch rail, the same hand she had placed in his in her father's study in January, and held it with the same certainty. And I love you, in case there was any question. There had not been, but it was very good to hear him say it. The summer of 1879 in Dusty Creek was long and hot, and full of the ordinary texture of two people weaving their lives together in the particular way of people who have each been largely self-sufficient, and are now choosing, with clear eyes and full deliberation, to be otherwise. Louis came to the feed store on mornings when his schedule permitted and helped Emma with the heavy deliveries, and Emma came to the livery on afternoons when her accounts were done, and watched him work the horses with an appreciation that was both aesthetic and something deeper. She learned about horses from him, not the basic knowledge she had always had as a feed merchant, but the language of their movement and temperament, the difference between a horse that is fearful and one that is resistant, the specific patience required to build trust with an animal that has been badly handled. She proved to have, under his observation, a natural instinct for the work, something Louis noted with the quiet pleasure of a teacher whose student has surpassed the expected level. He learned about the feed business from her, not because he needed to, but because she was interesting when she talked about things she understood deeply, and because understanding her world made him better at moving through it. He learned which suppliers could be trusted and which required close scrutiny, which ranchers were reliable and which needed managing, which market trends in grain and hay were worth watching, and which were simply the anxiety of people who had too much time to read the agricultural bulletins. In August, Clarence Boudreau came to Dusty Creek with his wife for a regional horse fair that was held every year on the fairgrounds at the edge of town. Louis had not seen Clarence since the day he had walked away from his stable without reckoning, and the encounter was brief and somewhat complicated. Clarence reported that Reckoning was in excellent health and had won 2 more races. He said this with the straightforward satisfaction of a man who is genuinely pleased with his acquisition, and if he noticed the particular quality of Louis's attention during this report, he had the tact not to comment on it. Emma was at the fair that day, and she was standing close enough to hear the exchange. She watched Louis's face while Clarence talked about reckoning, and she saw again that carefully controlled expression of loss worn with composure, and she thought about what it had cost him, not in money but in the deeper currency of attachment and trust and years of work. After Clarence moved on, she took Louis's hand, right there in the middle of the fairgrounds with half of Dusty Creek around them, and held it. He looked at her. "He sounds well," she said. "The horse." "He is," Louis said. "That matters," she said. "That he is well, I know it does not fix the loss, but it matters." Louis looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the fair, where a young cowboy was demonstrating rope work to an admiring cluster of onlookers, and horses moved in the round pens, and the smell of hay and dust and leather was everywhere. "It does matter," he said. He squeezed her hand. "Thank you." September came with its cooling nights, and Emma came to Louis one afternoon with an expression of focused purpose that he had learned to read as the look she had when she had reached a decision. She produced an envelope. "The remaining $250, she said. He looked at it. "It is September," he said. "You said next spring." "I had a very good summer," she said. The cattle rancher's accounts had come in strongly, and she had managed the inventory with unusual precision, and the numbers had moved in her favor. "It is all there." He took the envelope and held it for a moment without opening it. "Now," she said, "I have something to ask you." He looked at her with the full attention she had come to depend on. "The debt is settled," she said. "Between us, I mean, completely and properly settled." She held his gaze. "So what I want to ask you now has nothing to do with obligation or gratitude. It is a completely separate question." "All right," he said carefully. "Will you marry me?" she asked. Louis was quiet for long enough that another person might have begun to worry. Emma, who understood him, waited without anxiety because she could see from his face that he was not uncertain but was simply processing something that had arrived with more force than he had expected. "Yes," he said, and then with a smile that had nothing restrained about it, "though I had plans to ask you myself." "When?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "October," he said. "I had a whole thing planned." "What thing?" "I was going to ride out to Miller's Creek at sunset because it's particularly nice this time of year, and I had a ring from the jeweler in San Antonio that I ordered in June." Emma blinked. "You have had a ring since June?" "I wanted it to be right," he said, slightly defensively. She laughed and reached for him, and he met her halfway, and the kiss was the kind that comes after everything has been resolved and laid out cleanly, and there is nothing between two people except the good and irreducible fact of each other. "Where is the ring?" she asked against his shoulder. "You will get it in October when I was going to give it to you," he said firmly. She pulled back and looked at him with delighted indignation. "That is absurd." "It is principled," he said. "She got the ring in October." He did take her to Miller's Creek at sunset, as planned, and the light on the water was the particular amber gold of an October evening in Texas. And he got down on one knee in the dry grass with the kind of deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered. And he said things that she kept entirely private afterward because they were hers. And she said yes with the fullness of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not expect and would not have traded for anything. The ring was a simple band with a small inset garnet, unpretentious and precisely right for the woman whose hands were always working. They were married in November of 1879, in the Dusty Creek church on a morning of cold blue sky and thin sunlight, with most of the town present, because most of the town considered itself to have a stake in the outcome. Emma wore her mother's dress, which she had found wrapped in tissue in a cedar chest, and which had required almost no alteration because she was built so like her mother that the garment seemed to have waited specifically for her. Louis wore the best of his two good suits and had his hair cut the morning of and stood at the front of the church with Hector beside him as his only attendant. And when Emma came down the aisle on the arm of old Pete, who was the closest thing to a father figure she had left in Dusty Creek, Louis's expression was the most completely unguarded thing anyone in the church had ever seen on his face. Hector later reported to anyone who asked that the groom had gone completely still when the bride appeared, in the way a very good horse goes still when it encounters something remarkable, which was the highest compliment Hector's vocabulary offered, and which everyone who knew Louis understood to be accurate. The vows were the standard vows of the Protestant service, but both of them meant them in full, which was evident in the way they faced each other, and in the way their voices did not waver. And when it was done, and the minister declared them married, Louis kissed her in the church in front of everyone with a sincerity and completeness that had the widow Henderson pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. The reception was held in the meeting hall with music and food and dancing that went on until late in the evening, and Emma danced with Louis and danced with old Pete and danced with Hector, who was an unexpectedly good dancer, and who was mortified to be caught being so, and Louis watched her from across the room at one point with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that it rearranged the opinion several people had held about him being overly serious. He was not overly serious. He was simply a man who did not give his warmth to things that had not earned it, and the things that had earned it received it fully. They moved Emma's belongings into the livery house at the end of November, because the livery operation was the larger property and Louis had more room, but Emma kept the feed store and its attached back house as a business asset, renting the back house to a young schoolteacher named Agnes who had recently arrived from Missouri and found the town's available accommodations limited. The first months of their marriage had the quality of a good surprise, which is perhaps the best thing a marriage can be. They had known each other well enough before the wedding that there were no dramatic revelations, but there was the continuous discovery of small compatibilities and small differences that constitute the daily texture of sharing a life. Emma discovered that Louis was terrible at sleeping late, that he was up before the birds every morning with the cheerful inexplicability of a man who has no concept of leisure, which she found both admirable and mildly irritating on Sunday mornings. Louis discovered that Emma had very strong opinions about the arrangement of kitchen shelves and was not persuadable on the subject, which he found both slightly surprising and entirely consistent with everything he knew about her. They disagreed sometimes, as people with strong characters and strong convictions will. They had a proper argument in February about whether to take on a business loan to expand the livery operation, Emma in favor of the growth and Louis resistant to the debt, which was ironic enough given the origins of their story that Emma pointed it out directly, and Louis acknowledged the irony with a wry expression, and the argument was resolved more quickly than it might otherwise have been. Spring came to Dusty Creek again, the second spring of their acquaintance as husband and wife, and with it came news that expanded everything. Emma told Louis in April, in the same kitchen where they had talked through credit policy and loan debates and had coffee 1,000 mornings, that they were going to have a child. She told him directly, as she did all things, sitting across the table with her hands around her cup, and Louis went very still for a moment in the way she recognized as his processing response to something significant. "April," he said. "The doctor says October," she said. "Give or take." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, and he looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on him before, something raw and wondering and entirely uncontrolled. "We are going to have a child," he said. "We are," she confirmed. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his fingers. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I have been a little tired, but I am well." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have been so glad," he said, and the words were careful and genuine and they hit Emma somewhere deep. She nodded. She felt the specific ache of the absence, the grief that had not gone away but had been absorbed into the architecture of daily life, and she felt it with particular sharpness now. Her father would have been glad. He would have come to the store every day with some excuse or other, and he would have made himself useful and terribly in the way, and she would have been exasperated and grateful in equal measure. "He would have approved of you," she said. "He was a quiet man, too, and he valued work above almost everything else. He would have approved of you very much." Louis absorbed this with the gravity it deserved. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Emma attributed to having spent her whole life in physical work, and Louis attributed to the same thing and also to her general constitution, which was, in his assessment, about as robust as a person's could be. She worked in the store through the summer with only minor accommodations, and Louis managed his alarm with varying success, because he was a man who did not express concern through words but through action, and the actions took the form of appearing at the store to help with heavy lifting with an implausibility that was completely transparent, and which Emma tolerated with affection, because she understood it was his version of tenderness. Hector, who was 18 now and had settled into the livery as a permanent employee, noticed that Louis found reasons to be within 200 yards of Emma for approximately the entire pregnancy, which Hector found both extremely unlike Louis's usual self-sufficiency and completely understandable. In October, as predicted, Emma went into labor on a Tuesday morning, and Louis sent for Dr. Aldridge with considerably more urgency than the doctor found proportionate for a first-time father of an uncomplicated pregnancy. And the labor was long as first labors tend to be, but entirely without complication. And at 4 in the afternoon, a son arrived. They named him Robert James Lawson, the first name for Emma's father and the middle name for Louis, and he arrived in the world with the emphatic opinions about it that would, over the years, prove to be entirely characteristic of a child with two such decisive parents. Louis held the baby in the evening light of the bedroom with an expression of such complete dislocation from his usual composure that Emma, who was exhausted and sore and floating on a kind of relief so enormous it felt like peace, watched him from the pillow and felt the love she carried for him arrange itself into a new configuration, wider and deeper and differently shaped than it had been that morning. "He is very small," Louis said. "They generally are at first," Emma said. "He looks displeased." "He has just had a very difficult day," Emma said. Louis looked up at her with the rare complete smile. "You both have," he said. "We are both fine," she said. "Come here." He came and sat on the edge of the bed with the baby, and she leaned against his shoulder. And they sat like that in the October evening, while Robert James Lawson considered the world with the expression of a person who intends to have strong opinions about it for a very long time. The years arranged themselves in the particular way of good years, which is to say not without hardship or difficulty or the regular negotiation that any life requires, but with an underlying current of warmth and rightness that makes the difficulties manageable and the ordinary moments luminous. The feed store prospered under Emma's management. She was a better businesswoman than her father had been, not because she loved it more, but because she had a clearer eye for risk and a more disciplined approach to credit, though she maintained the flexibility for the cases where judgment overrode the ledger. By 1882, the store had expanded its inventory and established itself as the primary feed and supply operation for 4 surrounding counties. The livery operation grew as well, and Louis's reputation as a trainer became known well beyond Dusty Creek. He took on apprentices, young men he trained with the same patient precision he brought to horses, and the operation became a genuine institution. He never replaced reckoning. He trained many fine horses and found deep satisfaction in the work, but he never entered another racing competition himself, and when people asked about the Champion Bay stallion that old-timers remembered, he said only that the horse had gone to good hands and let the subject rest there. Emma raised the question of reckoning once, 2 years into their marriage, asking Louis if he had ever considered trying to buy the horse back from Boudreaux. Louis was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Reckoning found his place. He has everything he needs. There's no good reason to move a horse that's content." "Is that the real reason?" she asked. He looked at her. "I won't pretend the memory of him doesn't ache some mornings," he said. "But going back is rarely as good as what you imagine it to be. And what I have now is not a lesser thing. It is just a different thing." Emma leaned over and kissed his cheek, which was her version of saying she understood. Robert James, as he grew from an infant with strong opinions into a toddler, and then a boy of considerable energy and limited patience for sitting still, proved to be a combination of both his parents in the specific way that makes parents helpless with affection. He had Emma's dark eyes and her directness and her refusal to be managed, and he had Louis's composure and his way with animals and his tendency to go very still and focused when he encountered something genuinely interesting. He adored horses with the totality that children adore things they encounter before they know they are supposed to be careful about adoring them. And Louis taught him the fundamentals of the stable with the same unhurried patience he gave to his apprentices. Emma watched them together in the stable yard one afternoon in the spring of 1883. Louis crouched down at eye level with Robert, who was 2.5, explaining something about the way the gray mare moved. Robert's face was a picture of absolute concentrated attention, his small brow furrowed in a miniature copy of his father's thinking expression, and Emma stood at the fence with her hand on the rail and felt a love so large and complete that it required her to stand very still for a moment to contain it. Louis looked up and saw her watching, and he smiled, the full and unrestrained smile that she had learned to watch for, and she smiled back with everything she had. In the spring of 1884, Emma told Louis she was expecting again. This time he received the news with more composure, though the same wondering, raw expression appeared briefly before he settled it into the steadiness she depended on. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. "That's good timing," he said. "The season slows down in November." "I thought of that too," she said, and they were both laughing because of course they were. Of course they had both approached the timing of their child's birth with the instinctive consideration of two people who ran businesses and understood seasonal rhythms. The second child was a daughter, born on a cold November night when the stars were very clear, and they named her Clara, which had been Emma's mother's name. Clara arrived with considerably more efficiency than Robert had, and she had Louis's serious brown eyes and Emma's dark hair, and a temperament that was, from the very beginning, a precise combination of both her parents' most characteristic qualities. She was quietly determined and had strong opinions and was very hard to distract once she had decided something. And she was also, beneath all of that, deeply and demonstratively affectionate in a way that Robert would never have admitted to being at that age, but which was clearly in the family. The dusty creek of 1884 was different from the town Emma had grown up in. The railroad spur had come, as the rumors had suggested it might, and with it had come new residents and new commerce and the inevitable complications of growth. Silas Monroe had retired and sold the mercantile to a younger man from Kansas City, and the change in ownership meant the loss of Monroe's particular brand of financial grip on the town's struggling residents, which Emma observed with satisfaction that she kept mostly private. The feed store had a competitor now, a new operation opened by a man named Garrett who had capital behind him and undercut Emma's prices in the first year. Emma met this challenge with the comprehensive stubbornness she brought to all obstacles, improving her service, deepening her relationships with suppliers, and expanding her specialty inventory into areas Garrett had not thought to cover. By the end of the second year, Garrett had moved to a different market, and Emma's operation was stronger than it had been before the competition. Louis watched all of this with the focused admiration of a man who already thought very highly of his wife and keeps being given additional reasons. "You are formidable," he told her one evening when the children were asleep and they were sitting on the porch of the livery house where they had sat on 100 evenings before. "I am practical," she said. "You are formidable and you describe it as practical," he said. "Those are the same thing in your case." She turned her head and looked at him. Was that a compliment? It was an observation, he said. That was also entirely a compliment. She settled against his shoulder in the familiar way she had adopted over the years, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the Dusty Creek evening, which had not changed much in its essential character despite the railroad and the new residents and the passage of 6 years. "I think about my father sometimes," she said. "This time of year especially." "October," he said, "the month they were sitting in. He would have loved Robert and Clara," she said. He was a quiet man, but he was absolutely unable to resist children. He would have been an extraordinary grandfather. "He sounds like he was an extraordinary father," Louis said. "He was," she said. "He made mistakes with money, and he kept too many worries to himself, and he did not tell me enough, but he was an extraordinary father." A pause in which the October night breathed around them. "You know," she said, "when I found that ledger and saw the numbers, I thought for a few days that he had failed me, that he had hidden a disaster and left me with nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "And then I thought differently. I thought that the hiding was its own kind of protection, the same instinct you had when you settled the debt without telling me. He was trying to carry it himself so I would not have to." "You see the parallel," Louis said. "I see the parallel," she confirmed. "Which is one of the reasons I was not as angry at you as I might have been when I found out." She tilted her head back to look at him. "You were being my father. You were trying to carry something so I would not have to." "I was," he said. "I would do it again." "I know," she said. "I know you would. And now I know about it, so if you were inclined to do something of the sort again, I would prefer to be consulted." "Noted," he said with a very small smile. "Good," she said, and settled back against him. Robert grew up in the stable, and Clara grew up in the feed store, and both of them grew up in the intersection of those two operations, in a house where work was respected, and care was shown through action, and love was, if not always effusive, always present and reliable and real. Robert was, by the time he was 6, better on horseback than most grown men in Dusty Creek, a fact that Louis observed with the specific satisfaction of a teacher whose student has absorbed something important. Clara was, by the same age, able to calculate the price of a mixed grain order in her head before Emma had the pencil out, a fact that Emma observed with the same satisfaction. Hector, who had worked for Louis since before the marriage and who, by the mid-1880s, was a young man of 23 with his own small horse operation, and a wife named Maria who had come from San Antonio the year prior, was something between employee and family. Emma had known Hector since before she and Louis were married and thought of him with genuine affection, and the addition of Maria to the household's extended circle was a pleasure because Maria was warm and direct, and immediately at ease with Emma's particular brand of honesty, which not everyone found comfortable. The town of Dusty Creek continued to change, as all Western towns changed in the latter years of the 1870s and through the 1880s, absorbing the forces of modernity and commerce and the slow closing of the frontier. The cattle drives that had been the backbone of the region's economy began to give way to fenced ranges and railroad shipping. The great open runs of longhorns across the landscape were giving way to something more organized and considerably less romantic, and many of the men who had built their lives on the open trail found themselves navigating a world that was being remade faster than they could adapt. Louis watched this change with the equanimity he brought to most things he could not control and moved to adapt his operation accordingly. He expanded into providing stock horses for the ranches that were transitioning to fenced range operation, horses bred and trained for work rather than racing, and the operation grew in a steady and sustainable way. Emma watched the change from the vantage point of the feed store, which was one of those businesses positioned at the center of a community's metabolism, and therefore registered every shift and adjustment. She expanded her inventory to serve the transitioning operations, brought in new agricultural supplies, and added a small section of general hardware that served the practical needs of ranchers who found the feed store more convenient than a trip to the mercantile. There was a conversation in the spring of 1885, in the livery house kitchen over morning coffee, that closed the last open question of their story. Emma set her cup down and looked at Louis with the focused, direct expression that he knew was the precursor to something significant. "I spoke to Hector yesterday," she said. "He mentioned that Boudreaux passed away in February." Louis was quiet. "His wife is settling the estate," Emma continued. "Hector heard through the horse circuit that she is selling the stock." Louis looked at his coffee cup. "Reckoning would be 12 years old," Emma said. "That is a good age for a stallion who has been well kept. He could have 10 more years of good life." She paused. "I have the money, Louis. The store has been very good for 3 years. I want to buy him back." Louis looked up at her. "You do not have to make it a noble sacrifice," she said. "You are allowed to simply want your horse back." He was quiet for a long time. The children were asleep still, the morning being very early, and the house was quiet around them. "I don't know if he would remember me," he said. "You could find out," she said. He looked at her. "You would do this." "I want to do this," she said. "I have wanted to do something like this for a long time, and this is the right thing and the right time." She held his gaze steadily. "Let me give you something back." The morning light was coming through the kitchen window with the softness of early spring, and Louis sat in it and looked at the woman he had married and thought about a 4-year-old bay stallion he had walked away from 6 years ago, and about $350, and about how the things you give away sometimes find their way back to you in forms you could not have predicted. "All right," he said. Emma bought Reckoning for $280 from Boudreaux's widow, who was practical and businesslike, and expressed no sentimentality about the transaction beyond a brief comment that Clarence had always said the horse had been sold to him under circumstances that a better man would not have allowed. Emma had driven to the Boudreaux property herself, with Louis beside her on the wagon seat, and when they arrived and the stable hands brought Reckoning out into the spring daylight, the horse was 12 years old and as magnificent as any horse Louis had ever seen. The years had given him a settled power, a maturity in his bearing that the young animal had not yet possessed, and he was in excellent condition, the evidence of the care Clarence had given him, which had been genuine. Louis got down from the wagon and walked toward the horse slowly, in the way he had taught Robert to approach an unfamiliar animal, with the full attention and the quiet calm that spoke safety before a word was said. Reckoning turned his large dark eye toward Louis and went still. Louis stopped 3 feet from the horse and waited. The horse stretched his neck forward and touched Louis's shirt with his nose. A long breath, a pause, and then a second breath that was recognition. Louis put his hand on the stallion's jaw in the way he had done 1,000 mornings years ago, and Reckoning leaned into the pressure with the trust of an animal who has found something it had mislaid. And Louis stood there with his hand on his horse's face, and was, for a moment, entirely uncomplicated by anything. Emma sat on the wagon seat and watched this with the fullness that had become her accustomed condition, the love that had been building for 6 years, and showed no sign of finding a ceiling. They loaded Reckoning into the horse trailer they had brought and drove home to Dusty Creek in the spring afternoon, and Louis went straight to the large center stall in the stable, the one that had always been too big for Prairie, and for every horse that had occupied it since, and he settled Reckoning into it with fresh hay and clean water. Hector stood at the stable door watching this with the expression of a young man who is not going to cry, but is working very hard at it. "I remember this horse," Hector said. "He remembers too," Louis said. Robert, who was 4 years old and had never known Reckoning but had grown up on stories about the bay stallion told in his father's careful, understated way, stood at the stall gate and stared up at the horse with enormous eyes. "Is that Reckoning?" he asked. "That's Reckoning," Louis confirmed. Robert looked at the horse for a long, serious moment, with the expression Emma recognized as her husband's thinking face translated onto a small child's features. Then he looked up at his father. "He is very big," Robert said. "He is," Louis agreed. "He looks kind," Robert said. Louis looked down at his son, and then looked across the stable to where Emma stood in the doorway with Clara on her hip, watching them both, and he felt the full weight and meaning of his life arrange itself with a clarity and completeness that he could not have described in language, that existed beyond language in the way that the most important things do. Reckoning reached down from the stall gate and pressed his nose to the top of Robert's head, and Robert laughed with the pure instinctive delight of a child who has just been noticed by something wonderful. "He likes me," Robert said. "He has good judgment," Louis said. Emma smiled from the doorway and Clara reached for the light with her small hands, and outside the stable yard the Texas afternoon went on in its extravagant way, the sky too blue and the light too gold, and the whole wide western horizon laid out before them like a thing that had no end. That evening, after the children were asleep and the horses were settled, and the stable was quiet with the specific peace of animals and clean straw and the smell of good hay, Louis and Emma sat on the porch of the livery house in the last of the long spring light, and Reckoning's presence in the stable behind them was as palpable as a warmth at their backs. "How does it feel?" Emma asked. Louis considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like something that had been missing for a long time has been found," he said. "And like the finding is different from what I would have predicted, because I am different from who I was when I lost it." He was quiet for a moment. "It is better than I expected." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the way they had sat on 100 evenings on this same porch, except that nothing about it was ordinary. It was the accumulated weight of everything that had led to this moment: the grief of a young woman finding her father's ledger, the decision of a young man standing at a horse dealer's gate, the long, slow building of trust and love, and the brave, terrifying work of opening yourself to another person, and all of it had arrived here, on this porch, in this evening, in this life. Dusty Creek went about its evening business in the middle distance. Lights came on in windows. Someone was playing a fiddle somewhere near the saloon. A dog barked once and went quiet. The stars began to appear above the southern horizon in the way they always did. First one very bright and steady one, and then another, and then the whole vast field of them spreading overhead with the lavish, indifferent generosity of a Texas sky in springtime. Robert Lawson would grow up to be a horseman of considerable reputation, trained by his father and blessed with his mother's precision and nerve. He would marry at 24, a sensible young woman from a neighboring county named Ruth, and bring her home to Dusty Creek and build his own operation adjacent to the livery. Their first child would be a son, which delighted Louis and Emma and old Hector equally. Clara Lawson would prove, as she grew, to have the sharpest commercial mind in the family, a judgment that the feed store's accounts confirmed with regularity. She would eventually run the expanded Carver-Lawson supply operation that grew from her mother's small store into something that served 6 counties, doing it with the same direct competence that had characterized Emma's management of it, and adding her own particular brand of systematic thinking that refined the operation in ways Emma acknowledged with honest admiration. Louis trained horses until he was an old man, and the bay stallion Reckoning lived, with excellent care and Boudreaux's good foundation and Louis's devoted attention, until his 23rd year, which was a remarkable age for any horse and particularly for a working stallion. And when the end came, it was as peaceful as such things can be, in the large center stall of the Lawson livery in the early morning, with Louis's hand on his neck. Emma and Louis grew old together in the way that people grow old when they have built something real, with the particular ease of those who have long since sorted through all the important questions and found their positions compatible, and with the specific gratitude of people who know, because they have experienced the alternative, what it means to be alone. The love between them did not diminish with familiarity. It matured, the way good things mature, becoming richer and more complex and more quietly certain than it had been in the beginning. They argued sometimes, about money and about horses, and about the proper way to negotiate with stubborn suppliers, and about the question of whether the grandchildren were being spoiled. And the arguments were still conducted with the full force of two people who had strong convictions and full confidence in their right to hold them. And they were resolved with the same mix of reason and stubbornness and eventual humor that had characterized every argument they had ever had. They sat on the porch on summer evenings and watched the grandchildren run across the yard and said very little that needed saying, because everything important had already been said, over and over, in every way they knew to say it, and the silence between them was not empty but full of all of it. The ledger and the horse and the snow and the stable and the ring in October and the river at sunset and 30 years of mornings and evenings, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built together from the wreckage of loss and the material of love. On an evening in the late 1880s, when the children were grown and the grandchildren were beginning, and Dusty Creek had become a settled and substantial town, rather than the raw frontier settlement it had been when Emma first found that ledger, Emma and Louis sat on the porch in the long summer dusk, and Emma said, out of the comfortable blue of a long, quiet evening, "I am glad you were terrible at minding your own business." Louis looked at her. "I beg your pardon." "When Monroe was going to take everything," she said, "you minded a great deal of business that was not yours." "I mind my own business," he said with dignity. "You sold your champion horse to pay the debts of a woman you had never had a proper conversation with," she said, "and then spent 4 months pretending nothing had happened." She turned her head and looked at him with all 20-something years of knowing him behind the look. "That is a considerable amount of involvement in business that was not yours." He was quiet for a moment, and then the small smile appeared. "It turned out to be mine," he said. Emma considered this. The evening light was doing everything light does at its best, making the ordinary into something worthy of attention. "It did," she agreed. "It turned out to be exactly yours." And the stars came out over Dusty Creek, the same stars that had always been there, extravagant and unobstructed, and the night was warm and the porch was solid beneath them, and everything was closed and complete and whole, the way a life is when it has been built with care and honesty, and the kind of love that does not need to announce itself because it is present in every single thing.